Awesome. So, welcome everyone. This is the second AI in construction webinar where we're trying to kind of get down to the practical reality of AI and maybe get past some of the fluff. Once a quarter, I will present just me talking about the technology and what I think about it. Last time we covered a lot of basics. Next time we're going to get into some of the more specific fun stuff. But the other thing I wanted to make sure we do is talk to real people on real projects about what we think this is going to actually affect. And to that end, I've got a couple of pretty rock star folks. So I've got Stephen Poppy from HIT. He's in research and development, but spent a bunch of years also as a PM at a number of different contractors. And Don Speedy, who's a program director, has just joined Compass 3, I believe it is, but has actually spent some time at a number of other big contractors. And I'll be moderating. I'm Hugh Seaton. I'm CEO of The Link. So a couple of points here. As a moderator, there's a lot more flexibility than there might be if it's just me and my big mouth. So I really encourage people to ask questions along the way. This is early in the whole thing, so we're going to talk about what we've seen, what we've thought about, but also how we think this practically all hangs together. So to the degree you can do that in a webinar, we want to make this a bit of a conversation. So first, instead of unmuting yourself and talking, if you can ping in the chat, I'll stop things and answer questions and/or forward the question on. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit of a mess. So as I say, we've got two amazing people here, and that'll be the plan going forward: is to get people that are actually doing things to guide discussion and really share their thoughts. So I'm going to pass this over to Don in a minute, but Don, first let me set some stage here. What's out there now is a lot of what we want to talk about. You've heard me, some of you who've joined some of the earlier conversations. There's really two types of AI out there, and I think we bucket them all together unhelpfully. There's what I like to call wave 2, which is what sort of came out around 2013 and later. Deep learning is what you probably have heard. It's a version of machine learning, but the specific thing is deep learning. That's when you hear vision, voice, Alexa 1.0 and Siri and so on. All that was deep learning. What we're all excited about now, and what's the reason why you signed up for a talk like this, is what I call wave 3. Wave 1, if you're curious, was stuff that happened in the 80s that isn't so worth talking about. But this is generative AI. So it's ChatGPT, it's things like that are using text and language, image, like DALL-E and Midjourney, and a number of other things. There's some people doing music, there's some people doing video and so on. But the key thing here is, as we're thinking about this, it's important to make sure we're asking questions about the right thing. Deep learning tends to be good at classifying one thing or a couple of things. It's typically pretty limited. It's often quite powerful, nevertheless, when you compare it to software. Generative AI like ChatGPT, the reason everyone's so excited is it does so much. It's able to actually think about context. It's able to summarize things, and it's way more powerful. In fact, we're still a little surprised at how powerful it is. So kind of setting the stage with that, what we want to kick around a little bit today is, what's a strategy for even applying tools like this? And Don, this is where I'm going to pass it to you, because one of the insights Don started with when we were talking about this over the past month is, what do we do over and over again? If we think about how this might apply to construction, the first place to start is to be thinking about our processes and diving into those. So Don, do you want to take it from here, and I'll drive? Just tell me when you want to go from slide to slide.
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, I am by no means an expert on AI or anywhere close to it. I'm just a guy who's trying to make sure that our field activities stay, as efficient as possible, and trying to move our industry forward while doing that. And so I really appreciate you having me on today. First of all, you can hear me okay, right, Hugh?
Yep, you sound great.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. All right, yeah, so just stepping back and looking at the life cycle of a construction project as a whole, I tend to start, for example, design build is a hot way of doing construction projects rather than hard bid. And so if we look at it from that perspective, where we're getting the builder and the designer involved in projects right up front, working together. How can we
guys, if you can mute yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you. how can we streamline the process, from start to finish? And so what I started to do, and it was kind of a little bit of a grunt work, but just to put some thought into it, was I mapped out the overall process, and it's really just a high level view. And I started going through job descriptions. What does each and every role in a construction project, you figure, 20 to $100 million kind of project over 18 to 24 months. What does that look like? And how many different people are involved? What kind of tasks are they doing? What are their job descriptions say? And so just started to map out a little bit of that. It was a simple Excel spreadsheet, trying to get a kind of a tree of activities from basically, the project pursuit to pre-construction and design through buyout, and then the field activities. And what kind of jumped out and looking at it from that perspective is there two basically chunks. There's the design and pre-construction that takes a lot of work, and then where the rubber meets the road, which is the field. And so I kind of split those out from there. So if you want to bump to the next slide, we'll take a look. It starts to look like this, and then you start to go through and highlight what activities, specifically LLMs at this point. It seems like there's a lot of options for AI. It's the buzzword, so it ends up getting overused, definitely overused in our industry. And so we're trying to cut through that and find out, where is the meat that the average Joe can deliver on today, or expect to be able to roll into in the coming months or year, maybe 2 years. We all know it's moving faster than we can probably keep up with. And that was the purpose of this call, was to put our heads together and talk through it a little bit, because change is going to keep happening faster and faster. And we need to be good at keep rolling with it. So this is just kind of an exploration that we did. The design and pre-construction process, it's funny, I started going, okay, I think I've got some old job descriptions in my files, and I started pulling them up, and then I realized, this is taking a lot of work to put all this together. Why don't I just ask, I use Bing for this one, but why don't I just ask a GPT what the answer might be, for all these different job descriptions. And it started, very quickly, I got all these job descriptions. And, so part of this, is just retraining ourselves to use the tools at hand. And that, that was just a prime example. I think we've all got examples of that where we started to go, hey, wait, well, there's a better way to do this. This is great.
And Don, if I can throw in, so you created this analysis, and I think the whole point here is the first step about how AI may or may not help is to anchor in what it's going to help with, and that's sort of analyzing jobs, right? You said areas where LLMs can help us now, and you thought about it in terms of level of effort or time commitment. What was your thinking when you said that's the thing that's the lens you're going to look through? So as somebody who runs jobs, I mean, that's kind of why I'm asking. It's like you're thinking of this as someone who runs projects, and you're saying, all right, here's how I'm going to start to attack this problem.
So if we just focused on the repetition that people do day in and day out, I think there's a lot more repetition between our jobs than sometimes we'd like to admit. We all get very specialized in what we look at. From a designer's perspective, you're looking at your specific elements that you're designing. From a trade's perspective, you're looking at the specific trade you're involved in. But everybody's going to be involved in coordination. Everybody's going to be involved in putting together proposals and pulling numbers, applying unit rates to things, applying quantities to things. And so that happens again and again and again in our industry. And I think there's a lot of meat there for these tools to help us with those processes. And so that was the premise of trying to put this thought process together.
Got it.
And I think what you start to see when you look at this, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think we have to acknowledge that this is a paradigm shift, right? And I think the current paradigm is operating in a low signal frequency on information. And so, what our project teams are operating off of is not high frequency data. And I think even going back to the waves slide, I think we also need to recognize that within construction tech, that first wave or second wave of deep learning that never really got that mature, right? And I think when we talk about the different abilities for deep learning to inform predictive analytics, like we only started to scratch the surface there. And so I think what this third wave is now allowing is potentially avoiding some of the infrastructure required and getting quicker to that analytics phase. But sorry, Don, I felt like I needed to jump in.
Yeah, that's what we're here for, putting our heads together. I love it. So thank you, Steve. So yeah, this is just a flavor to get us thinking in the right direction. I mean, I see this and I see, quantity takeoffs is a common denominator here. And, I started out in Canada, which is very similar to the EU and how they operate. It's a funky crossover between, the European ways sometimes, with the metric system, and then the systems in the States. And, I started off attending like meetings for quantity surveyors. And the way they do it in the EU is there's a quantity surveyor that basically gives you the quantities that are demonstrated in the plans, and people go and basically propose off of that. So there's a common baseline, and there's no discrepancies as to what people are referring to. So it levels the playing field quite a lot. In the States, we don't do it that way. We all do our own quantity takeoffs because we really want to know. And there's a little more risk reward in that equation, but I could see AI tools at some point. They're not there now, especially when it comes to plans, in giving us a report of all the quantities that we're looking after. So that was just something that jumped out as well. Maybe we'll go full circle on that kind of a process. But in the meantime, we've got here's again the buyout stage in front of us. Very similar. You start getting 20, 30 trades on a job. That's a lot of eyes and people flipping through the same information, trying to get very similar information, never the same 100%, but always their own twist on it. So just some thoughts there. And if you're a lean practitioner, I mean, you can just start to see the waste in the process, right? So
then sort of step two, now that you've figured out, or at least started the process of looking at where there's repetition and the sorts of tasks that might be open to LLMs. I think the next question, right, Don, is what can they do?
Yeah, I mean, like the example I just threw out was part of this is just training ourselves to realize there are new tools. And one of the biggest time savers is, when you're a knowledge worker, you're working with very limited time and somewhat, you get decision fatigue. Your brain processes start to break down after so many hours in front of a screen. And so one of the ways to save on that energy and that bandwidth is to just use these tools to jumpstart your thought process. It's been fantastic for that. And it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It could just be, let's get a brainstorming process going, and you can get a lot of ideas very quickly along the same vein, if you're priming the pump properly with the GPT model.
And do you think, Don, a good analogy there is like if you hire someone who's a year or two out of school, they can get a lot of stuff started for you, and then it's up to someone with a little bit more experience to take that and shape it, and whether that's editing it or adding whatever it is. But you think of that as an analogy here that you're getting somebody junior who is smart and can read stuff, but doesn't really have the context to do it all the way. But it's almost as if you've got an extra PE who's particularly good at the library.
Yeah, fantastic example. And so, there, I would be great if everybody could chip in on this. I don't think that there's enough time for it, but I'd love to see what other people hear about what other people are gleaning from these tools that are out there and how they're putting them to work. I think there's going to be a lot of hacks and different ways of making ourselves more efficient from this, and it would be really interesting to crowdsource some of that information at some point. But in the meantime, we're starting to see point solutions come out of these tools. The link and specifications is a great example, Hugh, what you have going on there, and Stephen, it's a great example. And then just applying the same information for RFIs. How often does an RFI come out and it doesn't affect a particular trade, but there's the one RFI that does, that maybe they didn't write and somebody else wrote, and how do you know, how can you keep up on all that information? It takes a lot of tracking when you're a trade and you're looking at multiple projects across the board and you've got multiple, RFIs to screen through. And this technology can help streamline that.
Yeah, and I think another way to look at that too is
Yeah.
there's the AI application in the work stream it takes to develop specs or consume specs or develop an RFI or process a change order. But then there's also an AI application to help you consume that information. And I think that is where, if you look at the longitudinal study that Autodesk did that identified 13% of the working day of a project team is consumed just trying to find and access information. That's a huge problem that just allowing the project team members to access that information in a human chat agent informed interface can probably just take off that top line issue. But then to the other points you're making, as you integrate AI at the development phase, then what is that also doing? And I think what that also does is it potentially moves us from a kind of a push-oriented risk management style to a pool-oriented management style, which is instead of us creating processes and techniques so that we're mining all of the data, all of us separately are mining all of the data to find the risk, perhaps we have AI agents doing that, and we're able to only interact with the areas of risk that are being kind of raised to the surface. I think obviously that's a future state conversation to have, but it's certainly an interesting one.
Doesn't that speak a little bit to this concern that AI is going to replace people? And I think what you just talked about is, no, it's going to replace the tedious stuff so you can have more time to do exception management and apply the experience and intuition that only humans can do. And that really is that's what you're there for, right? Like shuffling and control Fing to find things. That sounded really naughty, but is not what you really want to be doing, right? You want to be thinking about stuff that you were looking for instead of looking for it.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think every team is attempting to stay on the critical path, right? I think increasingly with the complexity of jobs and the regulation that's associated, it's hard to do that. And so I think that is a huge funnel that AI can help solve. But sorry, Dan, I cut you off.
No, it's good. You talk about the 13% of the day-to-day just finding and accessing information. If we could cut that in half, that'd be fantastic. And then you're right, it gives us more time to focus on the soft skills of our industry. And when you're in management, a soft skill, emotional intelligence is key. And so when we get overwhelmed with tedious information, it really detracts from that. I think it was through COVID, it really hit home with teachers in our everyday lives, and how much stress, and they have this emotional outpouring that makes them really good at what they do. AI is never going to replace that emotional outpouring. That is something that we humans bring to the table and is basically irreplaceable. And so I see that translating a little bit to our industry with the emotional intelligence that we need to bring when dealing with clients and with conflicts in the field that are inevitable. That's where the effort's really needed.
So I'd throw out to you guys the last two bullets are related a little bit, and that is that when Ernst & Young's CIO, I think it was, heard about this in like January of this year when he was talking about ChatGPT, he said, I think this is going to be amazing for knowledge management. And construction is an industry that's got, obviously has a labor shortage, but also has a lot of folks that are later in their careers and looking at retiring. One of the things that we know this is good at is summarizing and finding information, and a way that might be used is knowledge management. How are you guys hearing or thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity. I mean, I think every business is looking at how they strategically think through how to overcome that hurdle, right? Means and methods kind of are the difference maker, and often case those are people, right? And so thinking through how we can use technology to kind of augment that reality, I think again, if we, I like to spend more time in the future state world because I'm R&D. So, but if you think about the disconnect between what's happening on the job versus what the documentation in the project folder shows is happening in the job, there's always a delta, right? And good project teams are attempting to close that gap. And so let's take schedule updates, for example. We'd all like to assume that that happens in a very structured environment, in a very collaborative environment, where all the superintendents have a say and the foremen are engaged, and we're getting an accurate portrayal in our schedule updates. But oftentimes that's not always the case, right? We've got text updates of hey, did this activity get done? Yes, or maybe no, that doesn't reflect reality. So I would say that there's one, from just a communication standpoint, there's a huge opportunity for tools like Nifty and others to fill that void, which is being implemented where the conversation is happening and being able to extract the thing and pushing that up or downstream, depending on where it needs to go, so that the paper trail matches reality. I think that's kind of an overarching category. But I don't think I really answered your question here, so I apologize.
I think it's all part of the same thing, is that because we have these narrow but still pretty competent little librarians that can read and summarize and find stuff for us. Suddenly, some of the stuff that was just too time intensive and too labor intensive to do, maybe you can outsource some of it. If it's 80%, 90% right, that's 80 or 90% you didn't have.
Yeah. So it makes us all that much more efficient. We get a lot of us get into construction because, well, I mean, let's take it back to the site where the rubber meets the road. We like to see work in place. Jobs run when work is put in place. People get paid for work in place. And a lot of us get into construction because we just love seeing all that stuff come together. The big trucks, the hauling of steel and craning it into place and welding it and all that other good stuff that goes on placing concrete. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff. I love it. And that's why we get into the business. And what we don't realize is there's basically 3 steps in the field that we go through. The first one is interpreting the mashup of the plans, the specifications, the other trades work that you have to interface with, the timing of all that. You've got neighbors, you've got city relations, you've got utilities, you have all of these different entities you're trying to dovetail and work together with. No matter where you are in the process, you've got some of that. And so this technology can really help streamline that. I mean, when you get into the industry, you don't get into it to do that stuff necessarily. You want to see the big things happen, the work go in place. But in order to get the work in place, you have to go through all the tedious stuff. And then there's a third step, which is basically documenting what happened. And because we're such a litigious business, we have to make sure that we're documenting it well. And tools are allowing for that more and more easily as we go. I just love there's quite a few of them, but, tools that basically, record your meetings for you and transcript them for you. I love it. That's just one less, nuisance that have to deal with, on site sometimes. So, there's some quality control and things you need to check for, but those are just some examples and thoughts.
Yeah, and I think one last point on lessons learned and knowledge management. I think one of the challenges with, getting lessons learned and extracting those from a project team and then operationalizing them into the next project is how you organize that information, right? Do you organize it by CSI division? Do you organize it by job number? I think oftentimes if you're able to solve the capture problem, the ability to position it for consumption is then another problem. And so I think that is an opportunity where if we're in a Gen AI, large language model AI reality, the specific organization becomes less relevant and it just becomes about the capture. And so if we make the problem 50% easier, I think that's potentially a huge boon for us.
We're only halfway there in terms of cool stuff this can do. I mean, the other thing, Don, certainly that you were thinking about is how can this help us speed up what you talked about before, right? The getting your arms around and getting the thing started.
Yeah, speeding up the jobs analysis, what we're looking at in the field specifically. I mean, there's all sorts of upfront planning and development that goes into this as well. And I don't want to shortcut that process, but I really see these tools being able to help us. At this stage, extracting information from plans, from the diagrammatic side, or the BIM element isn't quite there yet that I know of. Maybe you guys know of something else. But I don't see why we can't scan that information for all the text. There's a lot of text in plans that we could start to refer back to. We'll come back to that in a minute as far as analyzing plans, but definitely specifications, getting into submittals, being able to go talk to the tool and say, just give me this, I've got a question about, door hardware. Can I add a door hardware schedule that may or may not be in the documents already? There may be bits and pieces scattered throughout the specification in different ways, or the plans, and get me jump started on my door schedule or my window schedule, or how many types of flooring there are. And then you can kind of quickly understand all the different components that you're working with. Whereas current state, basically, or before these tools were available, you'd have to go and hunt and peck for that. So I see that being a real time changer.
One of the interesting things that really relevant to what you said in this idea about the table on demand. One of the things that I'm not sure if folks that are listening all recognize, but you can usually ask, certainly on the text side, to give it to you in a table or in a list, or various ways that make it useful for you. So we're used to going into tables that are already there and having to fill them out. But interestingly, one of the things that generative AI and the sort of chat implementation specifically are pretty good at is you can say, I want it this way or that way. Within limits, they can do, they can write code if they needed to, but you're not going to ask for that. That's interesting because it really turns applications on their head. If you're able to get something any way you need it, suddenly the whole UI or user interface becomes a really different conversation than what we're used to. And this is an example, I think, of one of those things that we're just figuring out. Like, what does that even mean? You know what I mean? Like when search was first happening in the internet, people kind of liked it. We're like, that's interesting, but it took a little while to wrap our heads around what that means. And I think this is going to be one of those examples.
Yeah, you think about a designer, an architect putting together a door and hardware schedule. That is a lot of tedious work that goes into producing those. Are we going to get to the point where you have it all in the spec somewhere, and you have it all tagged in the drawings, and you just ask for a report and the table's generated? I don't know. I don't see that being too far away, but it does get you thinking.
For sure.
Well, I think to your point too, Hugh, I think the idea of using AI to help people, do job analysis, but also learn the job in the way in which they learn is a really interesting concept, right? Which is, if you want to read 2,500 pages of spec content, fantastic. If you don't, then there's a tool out there that can help you kind of consume what you need to based on risk analysis. So I think that could be a really, really big kind of way in which different construction applications solve for that.
That makes a ton of sense. Hey, I'm going to stop us for a sec because I think we're going to get on to another sort of segment here and interject some questions. So, and these guys let's be patient with the fact that some of them are early, some of them are later. But so Santiago asked, how can a project catch up and align with stakeholders with all these technologies and applications? This is actually kind of a Stephen question, actually, and a Don one, because it's, the question is, how are you identifying, implementing, and making sure that these provide benefit? This is a little bit of the classic Contech. Everyone and their cousin has my phone number now, and everybody seems like they're going to cure cancer. But I think that's a good question for two ways. One is it's inbound technology. What are your thoughts? The other one is, how does a project catch up, or do you say we're good where we are? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a balance between the enterprise providing some strategic direction around, here's our data strategy, here's where we're at, and this is where we're going, while at the same time using projects to pilot different technologies based, under that umbrella of a thesis, and understanding and getting to understand how these technologies work or do not work, right? Because we know that there's still quite a bit of marketing in that space. And so, I mean, the old adage of not trying to boil the ocean, I think is very applicable here. And I think understanding what are the few things that are creating lots of problems that you can address. And I would say the whole point of using AI to access the right information is a great start, right? And that means a lot of different things depending on which workflow and which phase you're talking about. But I think it is important to have that line up to some kind of enterprise strategy so that the data stream created from the use of these AIs are also serving a larger purpose.
And actually, related to that, you brought up data and the fact that how these sometimes work is going to have an impact on cybersecurity in a way that maybe a mobile app 5 years ago might not have. One of the reasons I know a number of contractors, I don't know what the state of play is now, but had actually put a moratorium, like nobody in our company can use ChatGPT until we've figured out what our strategy is. And I think that was some of it. James Norris asked the question. It's going to matter that we know that the companies that are not caching or storing company data. And I think that's a really important one that has been, I think it's starting to be addressed, but I think, so there's really two things, James. I'm just reading through what you said. The first one is this idea of just making sure that they're not caching or storing company data. Have you come across people that are starting to represent that they're saying, look, no, we're not. And in fact, here's our policy or here's our approach?
I mean, at least from my angle, I think it's table stakes, right? I think in an industry where means and methods are the competitive edge, it's a starting point. And I think without that understanding that you're going to domain silo the data that we're going to pour into your application, there's no further on conversations if that's not true.
And I would also add my limited experience in this is that contracts also don't really give you a lot of flexibility to let their documents go out into the ether. That makes a ton of sense. Okay, so that was most of what James had. I'll get one more and then we'll go on. Interesting question. So Giannis mentions, wasn't BIM supposed to be a platform that would enable time and cost savings? The problem is when all the parties don't buy into the process, it can't work. Is that true for AI? I think that's a nice question because a lot of folks are still a little angsty about how BIM was going to save the world, and it's been late to do so. I feel like AI has the benefit of there are things it can do for an individual that already add value. But what do you guys think? Don, your knuckles are huge.
Right.
I mean, I think just to start out, I think BIM requires a cultural change around how you plan, right? And I think when that doesn't happen, you get a model that doesn't match the building, and the utility out of that is very little, right? And so I think one spectrum to analyze that question through is just the quantity of change management required to get value out of it. And I think that is the difference maker with AI is it takes very little cultural change to have a superintendent start chatting with your spec instead of control F keyword searching it. But I think at the same time, I think the point is valid in which the ways in which BIM hasn't maybe been all the things we all wanted it to be has a lot of different tentacles to it, right? Whether you're talking the trust equation at the project level, the contract structures that do or do not enable that. And I think that will increasingly become true around the adoption and application of AI. But I think at least day one, it's more naturally oriented because it requires less change management.
Yeah, that was really well put, Stephen. I still don't see BIM being used the way it's supposed to be, extensively across the board consistently. And there's so much more information that can be, nestled into those models, and it's just not happening for many, many reasons. But if you just looked at, how money flows and, follow the money kind of mentality, it takes money to populate that information. It takes time, and projects can move faster than we have time for sometimes. And, so it's a time money equation. And hopefully, some of these tools can be dovetailed into the BIM process that can help speed up the BIM process and get it more, have more of the information in the BIM built into it.
So one more question, and then we'll move on. So Harsh asked a question that's really interesting, and I'm actually going to preface it with a point Stephen made earlier about AI helping to gather data and helping to find information that might be too tedious or time consuming. So Harsh's question is that a lot of construction companies have segregated data. How do you imagine organizing these data points? And I think one of the points that this brings up to me is it's actually easier to protect data when it's hidden away in F drives than when it's all in one place. So an interesting question is, does this create new risk from a cybersecurity standpoint than was true before? But what do you guys think about how much the siloed nature of data might slow down the value of AI?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question. I would say that in a reality where when a submittal is put together, that PDF, that 15 megabyte file, whatever it is most likely sitting in 15 different data centers by the end of the approval cycle, speaks to some need to change that process. And so I think what we also have to do as we think about AI and its application to our industry is also how the paradigm of existing processes change. And so I think as you look at AI integrating itself into these workflows, it's potentially going to change the paradigm of how a designer is going to spec a material or a piece of equipment, and then subsequently the process associated with approving it. So I think that's where my head would go. But I don't disagree that day one, that's not where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I might be getting it over my skis here, but breaking away from that company siloed information and sharing more across the board is going to be a tough nut to crack in just the way we're wired. I do see, the industry evolving around that very quickly, though. You look at Microsoft and their, Copilot. You look at, and I think you guys are going to mention Procore, came up with their own Copilot. I don't know enough about how these data pools work together or behind the scenes. I don't think a lot of us know yet, but it'll be interesting to see how they basically segregate pools of information and yet still allow us to glean information from those pools.
One last one is the second half of Harsh's question, since we've had some really good questions here. How do we see AI being applied to the material side, specifically since construction materials are one of the major contributors of greenhouse gases and other things, by the way? It's something like 40% of solid waste. So how do we think AI might help with that? I would throw into that visibility is probably the first way, but what do you guys think?
I think if you look at the waste problem, I think it's easy to map that back to a few things. One, obviously rework. And the why behind the rework, I think is a good question to ask. And I would argue that part of the reason why we have a quantity of changes and last minute issues that lead to rework is poor information kind of signal frequency. So if drawings set A say this, and then that changes and evolves, and for whatever reason that foreman directing a crew didn't see that change, that's going to lead to rework. And so that material change could be directly impacted by improving the quality of information. But I think that's kind of a little bit of a cop-out to say how AI is going to address that. But I don't know, Don, what are your thoughts?
Well, you look at waste is a great starting point because it is so much of the green problem. There are other things going on, and I'm sure AI will solve other elements of it, like concrete emissions and stuff like that. But for now, if we just focus on the waste as being one of the biggest nuts out there for environmental, let's take a look at how AI is helping, like the clothing industry. Over time, I was watching a show based on like, I don't know, the 1800s, and you see the clothes. I mean, they're baggy, they're simple, they're just, they don't make them to fit people because it's all by hand. And so as we go through time, our clothes seem to be being more tailored to our bodies. This is fascinating. How do you get a run of clothes so tailored? How do you get shirts that are semi-custom? And I think AI is going to help with a lot of that analysis and more customization as we go. And I think a lot of that's going to bleed over from other industry. When you take all these parts and pieces, I don't see us getting away from custom buildings anytime soon, because so much of what we do is not off the shelf, prefabricated buildings, or I do see us getting more prefabricated components. The beauty about prefabricated elements are they can be sized to a certain, dimension that minimizes their overall waste and, things like that. But if we're still doing a customized process, AI can help with automating a lot of that thought process over time. I don't have the answer yet. I haven't seen it yet, but I could see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, even one example of that, parametric modeling kind of in a kit of parts kind of design context, I mean, is really interesting, right? If especially when you're looking at the quantity of mission critical work, really a lot of the data centers being built are pretty simple structures, and the complexities in the MEP systems. And with that in mind, could we move to a model where it is, that there's using that parametric model, can we give the flexibility needed within the context of, depending on which item you select, you kind of get a pre-printed list of materials identified, and then within that box you can customize to your MEP needs. I think there are definitely some things that can happen in that space.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to skip us ahead. So we talked about step 1, which is identify tasks. Step 2, identify what the tools can do. Step 3 is really, okay, put those two together. So we had an example of that. But I think what I'd like to do is we've talked about this being about an hour with time for plenty of conversation afterwards. I want to talk a little bit about the state of play, where things are now. Don, do you want to take a crack at this?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, trust is so important in anything we do when we're dealing with the volume of money and the number of people across the board. And so it's important to be able to strike up trust quickly and efficiently and effectively. ChatGPT 3 came out, and you jump in and you start playing with it, and it was definitely an eye opener. Definitely made headlines for a reason. But you'd quickly realize that just because you can jump in and sound like Shakespeare one minute and a business person the next, by fine tuning them, the question and the way you prime the pump on with the model or with the chat, you get different answers sometimes to the same question. And when you start getting numbers involved, I mean, math is math. 2 + 2 is 4, and so you can't get variations of 2 + 2. And ChatGPT 3 initially was giving false answers for very simple mathematical questions. So a lot of what we deal with are quantities and dollar values and very math related stuff. So I think a lot of this is finding the system that works for you and building that trust. Bard versus ChatGPT, for example. I don't think Bard uses a different model or a different engine for their chat model, and so I don't think they had the same math problems. Again, this is also new. We're still feeling our way through this as an industry, but until we get trust in the system that we're using or systems we're using, it's not going to be taken seriously. So Hugh, and I think you had some, Hugh or Stephen, I think you guys had some good comments on trying to dial that in.
Yeah, I would throw in the bottom half of this slide is probably me, but having built AI a bunch, I'll say that there's an interesting point that doesn't get talked about enough, and that is that it almost like the quality, time, and cost triangle that you hear in construction and basically almost every other industry. There's kind of a triangle here too, where you have accuracy, the size of the problem, and the amount of data, and they're all a trade-off on each other. If you want to have high accuracy, you're going to want to try to narrow the problem and give it lots of data. If you've got a big, and so you think for a moment about when you're asking, whatever, a chatbot or whatever it is, if you're asking it to go find something, it's probably going to be all right. The math problem was a really funny thing, and I think they figured that out. But it's weird that it's doing the most advanced math in history, and it couldn't add 2 + 2. But the point here is, as we think about what we're asking AI to do, it's easy to make it a really big bucket and say just AI will handle it. But the reality is there's a little bit of process engineering on our end, because we never have a lot of data in construction. We think we do, but compared to the places that really train a lot of AI, we kind of don't have the same data that looks the same that you can aggregate and train models on. So often what we want to do is see how we can make the problem, either make the problem narrower or accept lower accuracy and have a human much more a part of the process. So I think that's a big part of trust is respecting the limits of what the tool can ever do, or at least can do at this point, and saying, okay, I trust it to go find things and help me, get started. I don't trust it to complete really anything. I think that's a bit extreme, but trusting an AI of almost any kind I've ever seen to just go and do it. I don't think anyone's doing that, but it speaks to the point where you want to think about the size of your problem and how accurate you need to be, because again, almost nobody has enough data. Because really, to train AI, you're talking hundreds of thousands and millions of data points. It's really hard to pull that out of any construction company I know. We don't have enough of the same thing that you can line up into that kind of a training solution.
Well, and I think the positive part of this is that I think the weight of responsibility is on the folks in our industry from a technology standpoint to build products and applications that prove this out, right? And I think the way to do that and the way to win in our industry in general is transparency, right? And so I think the ways in which, it's interesting, Procore announced its Copilot feature, like groundbreak this week, and almost every construction tech company is now talking about some kind of GPT plugin. And I think the difference makers in that space are going to be the ones that can show you clearly how they take a differentiated approach to training their model, and the ways in which they can kind of routinely show consistent results. And so I think it'll be on the onus of on them.
Awesome. So continuing through, this is a little bit of a survey of what we've seen. So, things like takeoffs and clashes and so on. So there's some stuff out there that's good, some stuff that we're not so sure about. I threw down some ideas here, but you want to talk about what you guys are seeing out there in terms of products and so on that are either kind of AI for that matter, but things that you're seeing that seem to be working, or at least have promise, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the scheduling space, there's a number of applications that I think are in the mid pivot between, at least from a marketing standpoint, referring to themselves as deep learning that's going to inform predictive analytics, to now truly being maybe an element of LLM AI plus deep learning plus all these different things. And I think what AI is allowing them to do, again, from a information consumption standpoint, but it seemingly is really helping to move the needle into predictive analytics and providing, this is what we know of the schedule, and this is potentially what we know from a risk analysis standpoint. So there's companies like ForesightWorks and Alice Technologies. They're all taking a different angle on it. But I think P6 has been ripe for disruption for about 20 plus years. So it's seemingly we're finally getting the technology we need.
Yeah, and Oracle's tapping into that in their own way too, which is great. And I love that you brought up scheduling, Stephen, because there's a lot of meat there to evolve, and predictive analytics. I would tack on safety to that. predictive analytics and safety and the different operations that are happening in the field at any given time. There's some pretty good data across industry that can point us to a clear picture as to what to expect. I just simple tools like I mentioned before, the meeting minutes, and just being able to transcribe a lot of that stuff and just handle a lot of that back end work. I thought simple things like that are great for the average guy just picking up a tool and jumping in with a low risk. You can scan it pretty quickly, and depending on your company oversight, they may be on board with that, they may not. So
I love that you brought that up, because it speaks to the fact that there are a lot of lower risk but maybe high time tasks, right? You're moving stuff around, and you know what, if it gets moved to the wrong thing, nothing breaks, you just wasted a little, you just have to redo it. But or meeting minutes, or call recordings, whatever, like this thing right here, we're going to run through a transcription, which you could never do before, and now actually you get that almost for free. Really interesting. So continuing on a little bit, this is kind of interesting. There was a question a little bit about, do we think it'll work to find scope gaps? And as someone who focuses on this particular thing, an interesting thing is if you train it to do that, it will. Humans can look at a scope and ask better questions than AI can right now, because after 10 or 20 years of doing it, you just know what to look for. And you kind of got to train it to do that, but then it can. It's interesting though about a question like scope gaps is it can summarize past learning. So then it can look at a spec and say, I've seen this before, but do it lightning fast, not having to go through 4,000 pages and do an analysis. So I think that's where you're going to find AI helping with things like that, right? Is that if you train it, it can do it fast, and it can do it 50 times. If you want to go back and look at something, it can do it again without you having to have a 60,000 a year kid per person do it.
Well, and to piggyback on that, our industry has a problem where you do rotate people through different companies depending on the ups and downs of the economy or the project cycle within a company, and so you get a lot of institutional knowledge that's leakage there, I guess you could call it. And if I could definitely see these tools helping us if you're taking a lot of those lessons learned from past projects that a company has done, whether it's your individual trade or as a general contractor or even as a designer, and a lot of knowledge information that here's our lessons learned as a company, and it all goes into that pool of data. And then you have the AI scan for the most common elements, or how did those elements in the past affect what I'm facing now. I think there's going to be some real cool evolution there, and a lot more tightening of the work, which all translates into the field, translates to schedule, translates to cost, the waste and the rework factors, all integral.
Love it. So we're pretty much at the end of our hour. A couple of things that we expect to see, but I want to hold for a particular question Stephen brought up. I think we're going to see bridging gap between point solutions. I think that AI is going to do a very good job, especially Gen AI. This idea that AI can write its own code is interesting, because again, you may find that you're able to spin up the kind of the screen or the table or whatever pretty easily in a way. And I think it's going to take a minute for us to get used to that. It's also going to mean data becomes the important point, not necessarily the app. Interestingly, everybody's talking about blending images and text. Like that'll happen this year. So GPT-4 is definitely going to do it. There's a few others. So suddenly it's not just doing text, but it can look at a graphic and then write about it. That'll be really interesting. And I think just to finish up with the idea of extraction of dark data. So we talk about having lots of PDFs around job sites or in F drives that have knowledge and history locked up in them in a format you can't do anything with. It's the sort of thing that generative AI is good at. So I think you're going to hear more about that. So I wanted to kind of close out the hour, and we've got more time, but I'm respecting the fact that a lot of folks probably just gave us an hour. Is the last week has seen a fair number of the last period has seen a lot of new co-pilots. So what happens when everyone has a co-pilot? Stephen, I'm going to pass this one over to you because it was kind of your insight, but this is a good time if folks have questions or thoughts, pop on in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that is the question. Like if you look at we've talked about the application level integration of Gen AIs. We've got at the project level, you potentially will have large language model AI chat agents. Then you'll have Procore Copilot, and then if you're operating off of the Office 360 reality, you potentially have Microsoft Copilot, and then on top of all of that, you potentially have some kind of enterprise level LLM AI, which is helping you access enterprise level information. And so I think, at least from my thoughts, there's probably an ideal path and then probably a not so ideal path. And I think on the ideal path side, potentially these AIs become essentially supercharged kind of integrations that help to communicate metadata and situational context between all of those different ecosystems so that the delivery of information becomes really dynamic. And on the not so ideal end of that spectrum, we potentially get in a point where maybe incumbents are building moats around their AI ecosystems, and applications end up having to play, Team Procore or Team Autodesk or whatever. Or we get to this point where, again, there's just so many AIs stacked onto top of each other where we're not able to capitalize on the real benefits. So some different pathways there for sure.
I wonder if this plus cybersecurity is going to continue the push towards more and more sophisticated IT teams. Outside of construction, there's a lot of industries, I would argue most, but I don't want to go too nuts with that, where the IT function has a lot more strategic input than is often true in construction. Again, that's changing for some contractors and less so for others, where the CIO is actually thinking about how to drive the business, not just support functions of the business. And this may be one of those instances, because to the point you're making, nothing's going to make the players play well together than 10 powerful CIOs saying, then we're not going to work with you, right? Which is what happens elsewhere. Doesn't always. There's still a Microsoft. So clearly it doesn't always happen. What do you think, Don? This whole idea of Tower of Babel.
Yeah, I think I think it'll be interesting. I don't want to read the tea leaves too much, but I'm looking. I tend to be overly optimistic, and I think it's going to get a lot better before it gets a lot worse. But there will be some bumps along the way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, that's the best we can do. Awesome. This has been a really good conversation. There's 2 points I want to throw in from Alexander. So it's more of an observation, but it's an interesting one when we think about there being lots of co-pilots. But the idea of that in the future, you're going to need less and less data. I think that's a really interesting one, is that what if these start to need less, right? Like, and I think in a certain way, the point of of a large language model and some of these other generative AIs is they trained it on other people's data. Now you get a version of it that you can fine tune for your own use. So you really don't require all that information. If nothing else, that alone makes this a better technology for construction than deep learning was, which I think is really interesting. I don't know. What do you guys think? That's like throwing a little bit of technology out there, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to think about one large leap in technology and not consider what are the other leaps that are going to happen, right? And I think we were all talking about blockchain a few years ago, and I think at some point, maybe that technology becomes relevant alongside an AI to kind of provide maybe the core to from a storage standpoint. But I do agree with the premise. I think ultimately, if you solve for information access, you potentially also solve for the duplication of data. So it's a good observation.
Yeah, so much of the information that we access is duplicative, or clashes, cites things wrong. You need clarification, and so I could see just eliminating those elements because there's a clear path that's been defined. just even us sitting in a room, putting all our thoughts together, if you have a team of designers and your builder in the room as they plan out these projects, and your owner, of course, pooling that information into a system that can, develop it in a more concise, clear way, will decrease the amount of information we have to intake.
Yeah, love it. Last question relates to the CIO comment, which is, what do we think about data quality monitoring and internal company QA of these tools? My first pass at that is those teams are going to usually need to be built out. There are some companies that are ready for it, but most probably are not. So I think that's another opportunity for the IT/CIO team to just become more strategic and critical.
Yeah, I think that's, I think the industry has been talking about the value of their own data for a while. And I think it's now, it's getting to a point where you really have to operationalize that strategy, or else you will be somewhat left behind.
And maybe this is something that will spur people to say, I have a better understanding of why. Because, I think in the past, data analytics is really abstract. And until you built it, you don't always know the value of it. You just kind of sense maybe. But in this case, maybe this will be a much more concrete way of saying, yeah, this is worth spending the money on data. And maybe we don't need to spend as much as we would have for deep learning either, because it's a little less finicky.
Yep.
Awesome.
Let me ask you a question. Does this technology, do LLMs bring a version of deep learning that we can tap into without having to go down the deep learning path? I don't know if that makes sense, but
I'll make it make sense. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, could LLMs help to organize data so we could use it to train a deep learning model? The answer is absolutely. You need to train the LLM to do it, but one of the things that you're going to find is that they're able to take data and do things with it, because they have a context that classic deep learning doesn't. Excuse me. Worth noting that large language models are a version of deep learning, but they're massively more complex, massively, or literally orders of magnitude. That's a great question, and I think that's one of the points. Like we talked before about dark data. One of the things I think you're going to find, whether it's service companies that like consultants that are spinning things up, or it's startups, you're going to find folks that will come and say, we can take your data and do things with it. And it's an interesting point, is to say, maybe we'll take every one of your RFIs and normalize them so that they can be plugged into a model that can do interesting things. I could absolutely see that happening. I think it's probably harder to do than it sounds, but it's certainly within the realm of what we understand this tech can do. Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of time. We're about 6 minutes after the hour. Thank you, both of my guests, Stephen and Don. Fantastic having you. Really great conversation. And for everybody that was kind enough to put some questions in there, really great questions. I appreciate all of your input.
Yeah, that's fun. Thanks you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.